I forgot my purse at the restaurant and went back to get it. The place was almost empty, the lights dimmed, chairs already flipped onto tables. As I approached the counter, the manager hesitated, then leaned closer and whispered, "Ma'am, I can show you the security footage, but please don't faint when you see it." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a mistake. 10 minutes later, I was gripping the edge of a chair, my legs trembling. What my husband did on that video didn't just shock me. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I hadn't even realized my purse was missing until we were halfway home. My husband was driving, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping lightly against the door to some song playing on the radio. It had been a pleasant evening. Nothing extraordinary, just dinner at a familiar restaurant we'd visited dozens of times before. Comfortable, predictable, safe, or so I thought. "I think I left my purse," I said casually. He frowned, glancing at me. "At the restaurant?" "I think so. I'll just run back and grab it." He offered to come with me, but something in his tone felt off. Too quick, too eager. I told him it was fine, that I'd be back in a few minutes. He nodded, relieved in a way he didn't try very hard to hide. The restaurant looked different when I walked back in alone. The warmth from earlier had drained away, replaced by the sterile quiet of closing time. A single employee wiped down the counter. The manager stood near the register, flipping through paperwork. I approached him. "Hi, I was here earlier tonight. I think I left my purse." He looked up, and for a brief second, something crossed his face. Hesitation, recognition, concern. Yes. "I remember," he said slowly. "Could you come with me for a moment?" That should have been my first warning that he didn't lead me to the lost and found. Instead, he guided me toward a small office near the back. The door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded much louder than it should have. "Your purse is safe," he said quickly, as if sensing my unease. "But there's something else." I wasn't sure whether to say anything, but when I realized who you were, I felt I should. My stomach tightened. "Say what?" He exhaled and lowered his voice. "We had an incident earlier tonight. Nothing criminal, but unusual, and it involves your husband." I frowned. I didn't leave the table. We left together. His eyes flicked up to meet mine. "No, ma'am. You went to the restroom." He stayed. I opened my mouth to correct him, then stopped. I had gone to the restroom, just for a few minutes. I remembered now, him checking his phone, telling me he'd order dessert while I was gone. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," the manager said carefully. "But what happened afterward? Well, we reviewed the security footage because another guest complained." "Another guest?" My pulse started to pound in my ears. "What kind of complaint?" He hesitated again, then gestured toward a monitor on the desk. "I can show you. But please sit down first." I laughed weakly. "I'm fine." He didn't smile back. "I really think you should sit." I did. The screen flickered to life. Grainy footage. The angle was wide, covering the dining area near our table. I saw myself stand up. I saw my husband smile up at me. I saw me walk out of frame. Then I watched him change. The smile dropped almost instantly. He looked around, checked his phone, and leaned back in his chair with a familiarity that made my chest tighten. Less than a minute later, a woman approached the table. I didn't recognize her at first. She was younger than me, confident. She didn't hesitate. She slid into the seat across from him like she'd done it before. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't shake hands. They leaned in. My hands curled into fists in my lap as I watched them talk. Laugh. His body language shifted in ways I had never seen directed at me. Relaxed, flirtatious, intimate. He reached across the table and touched her wrist. She didn't pull away. Then came a moment that made my legs go weak. He took off his wedding ring. Not discreetly, not nervously. He placed it on the table between them, like a joke, like a prop. She laughed, picked it up, turned it between her fingers, and set it down beside her glass. I felt something inside me collapse with terrifying quiet. The footage continued. Her hand on his knee, his fingers tracing patterns on the table, dangerously close to hers. The way he leaned in when she spoke, as if nothing else in the room existed. This wasn't a mistake. This was rehearsal. I stood up too fast, the room spinning slightly. The manager reached out instinctively, but I waved him off. "I'm okay," I said, though my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. He paused the video. "Your purse is right here," he said gently, sliding it toward me. "Again, I'm sorry. If it were me, I'd want to know." I nodded, unable to speak. As I walked out of the restaurant, purse clutched to my chest, one thought repeated itself over and over with chilling clarity. This wasn't the first time, and now that I had seen it, everything was about to change. I don't remember walking to my car. I remember the cold air hitting my face and the sound of my heels on the pavement, but the movement itself felt automatic, like my body had taken over while my mind stayed behind in that office, frozen in front of the screen. By the time I sat in the driver's seat, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel with both of them just to steady myself. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had always imagined that if I ever caught my husband doing something like that, I would break down instantly. Tears, shouting, confrontation. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow clarity, as if my emotions had stepped aside to let the truth pass through unfiltered. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot slowly. The restaurant's lights faded in my rearview mirror, but the images from the footage stayed sharp, looping in my mind with cruel precision. The way he checked to see if anyone was watching, the ease with which he removed his ring, the familiarity between them. None of it looked improvised. It looked practiced. As I drove, memories began rearranging themselves without my permission. Little moments I had dismissed over the years suddenly took on new meaning. Late dinners that ran longer than expected. Business trips with vague explanations. The way he sometimes smiled at his phone and then tilted the screen away when I walked into the room. All those moments had been filed away as harmless, because trusting him felt easier than questioning him. Now, trust felt naive. When I pulled into our driveway, his car was already there. He must have come home while I was still at the restaurant. The house lights were on, warm and inviting, like nothing had changed. That normalcy almost undid me more than the video had. I sat in the car for a full minute before going inside. When I opened the door, he was in the living room, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled. He shrugged and went back to his phone, completely at ease. Watching him in that moment felt surreal. This was the same man who, minutes earlier, had slipped his wedding ring off like it meant nothing. The same man who had leaned toward another woman with a look I hadn't seen directed at me in years. And yet here he was, acting as if the world were exactly as it had always been. We didn't talk much that night. I told him I had a headache. He offered to make tea, kissed my forehead, and went to bed early. I stayed up, sitting on the edge of the couch, replaying the footage again and again in my head, not to torture myself, but to anchor myself to reality. I needed to be sure. By the time I went to bed, something inside me had already shifted. I didn't curl toward him like I usually did. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing even out as he fell asleep. For the first time since we'd been married, I felt like I was sleeping next to a stranger. The next morning, I woke before he did. I moved quietly through the house, making coffee, sitting at the kitchen table, watching sunlight spill across the floor. My mind felt calm in a way that almost scared me. No panic, no spiraling, just focus. I opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I needed information. Not accusations, not explanations. Facts, patterns, proof. I started small. Phone records, credit card statements, calendar entries. Nothing dramatic at first. Then small inconsistencies. Charges at places I'd never been. Dates that lined up with his late meetings. Repeated transactions that suggested routine. By mid-morning, I wasn't surprised anymore. This hadn't started recently. The woman from the restaurant wasn't a fluke. She was a continuation. He came downstairs around 10, cheerful, oblivious. "You're up early," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied, meeting his eyes. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Suspicion. Then it vanished, replaced by the familiar mask. "Good," he said. "About a busy day." I watched him leave, his keys jingling softly as the door closed behind him. That was the moment I understood something important. If I confronted him now, he would lie. He would minimize. He would explain the footage away as harmless flirting, a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context. He would cry, or get angry, or turn around on me. And if I let him, He would drag me into chaos where truth would become negotiable. I wasn't going to do that. What I had seen on that screen had already given me all the answers I needed. Now, I needed something else. Control. Not over him. Over myself. By the time he came home that evening, I had already stopped thinking of this as the end of my marriage. I was thinking of it as the beginning of my exit. The calm didn't fade the next day. If anything, it settled deeper, spreading through me like a decision my body had already made before my mind caught up. I woke up early again, not from anxiety, but from clarity. There was no frantic urge to check his phone, no impulse to demand explanations. I already knew what I needed to know. Anything else would just be decoration around the truth. He kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, his hand lingering on my shoulder in a way that would have once reassured me. Now it felt performative, like a gesture practiced for an audience that no longer existed. I smiled back because I understood something he didn't yet. This version of normal was on borrowed time. After he left, I returned to the dining table with my laptop and a notebook. I didn't dramatize what I was doing. I didn't call it planning or plotting. I called it preparation. There's a difference. One is fueled by emotion, the other by self-preservation. I wrote dates, times, patterns. I compared statements with calendars. I cross-checked locations. Slowly, a picture emerged that was far more unsettling than a single act of betrayal. This was a parallel life, maintained through habit and confidence. He hadn't been hiding frantically. He had been comfortable. That realization hurt more than anything else. I thought about the manager's warning, "Don't faint when you see it," and understood now why he'd said it. It wasn't the act itself that weakens your legs. It's the recognition that someone you trusted has been moving freely in a reality you were never invited into. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A text from my husband. Lunch ran late. Might be home a bit later tonight. I stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. Okay, I typed. Nothing more. No questions. No concern. That restraint felt powerful. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I went about my routine, laundry, errands, small tasks, while my mind worked steadily beneath the surface. I wasn't dissociating. I was integrating. Every memory that surfaced was being refiled with new context. Conversations that had once confused me now made sense. The puzzle wasn't missing pieces. It had been upside down. When he finally came home that night, he looked tired but relaxed. He talked about work, about traffic, about nothing that mattered. I listened, nodded, responded appropriately. I knew him well enough to know he sensed a difference, but not enough to understand it. Over dinner, he reached for his glass and caught my eye. "You're quiet," he said lightly. "Just thinking," I replied. "About what?" I met his gaze. "About how quickly things can change without you realizing it." He laughed, uneasy. "That's true." Yes, it was. That night, lying beside him again, I noticed how detached I felt from the situation emotionally. That detachment didn't mean I didn't care. It meant I'd stopped reacting. Reaction keeps you tethered to the moment. Detachment allows you to move beyond it. I realized something that unsettled me deeply. If I confronted him now, I would be doing it for him. For relief, for answers, for emotional release. If I waited, I would be doing it for me. And I was no longer willing to prioritize his comfort over my future. The security footage had given me proof. Time was now giving me leverage and silence. My silence was becoming the most revealing test of all. By the time I finally drifted asleep, one thought had settled firmly in place. He thought he had gotten away with something. What he didn't know was that I was already 3 steps ahead, and I had no intention of warning him. By the 4th day, the shock had fully transformed into observation. I wasn't emotionally distant. I was alert. It felt like my senses had sharpened, tuned to details I had overlooked for years because love had trained me not to look too closely. Now I saw everything. The way he angled his phone screen away from me when messages came in. The way he stepped outside to take certain calls, lowering his voice instinctively. The way his schedule shifted just enough to stay plausible but never predictable. These weren't new behaviors. They were familiar ones, finally stripped of their camouflage. I tested something small that morning. "I might stop by your office later," I said casually as he poured coffee. He paused, just a fraction of a second too long. Oh, today's not great, he replied. Meetings all afternoon. I nodded. No problem. But there it was. Confirmation without confrontation. People who live honestly don't flinch at transparency. People who live in parallel narratives do. After he left, I sat in the quiet house and allowed myself to feel the weight of what I was accepting. This wasn't about catching him again. It wasn't about proving anything. The video had already done that. What mattered now was understanding the full scope, how long, how deliberate, how embedded this behavior was in his life. I began organizing everything I gathered, not chaotically, chronologically. I created folders, timelines, notes. Each piece of information stood on its own, but together they told a story that was disturbingly coherent. This wasn't an impulsive affair. This was a system, and systems don't collapse from emotion. They collapse from disruption. I thought again about the manager at the restaurant, his hesitation, his quiet concern. He had seen something out of place and acted on it. Not dramatically, just responsibly. That small act had cracked open a reality my husband had carefully maintained. One forgotten purse had undone years of secrecy. The irony wasn't lost on me. That afternoon, my husband called unexpectedly. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "I don't know," he replied quickly. "You just seem distant." I smiled to myself. Distance feels threatening only to people who rely on proximity to maintain control. "I've just been tired," I said. He accepted that explanation too easily. Another habit. He had grown comfortable with me absorbing discomfort quietly. He assumed I always would. That assumption was his greatest mistake. When he came home that evening, he brought takeout, an uncharacteristic gesture meant to signal attentiveness. I thanked him, ate, listened. I noticed how often he checked his phone during dinner, how quickly he responded to certain messages. His attention wasn't divided. It was allocated. Later, as he showered, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The pattern was already complete. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and understood something with absolute certainty. The footage didn't weaken my legs because of what he did. It weakened them because it showed me who he had been willing to become while standing beside me every day. That knowledge doesn't demand confrontation. It demands decision. And I'd already made mine. The decision didn't arrive with a rush of courage or a dramatic inner speech. It came quietly, the way certainty often does after doubt has been exhausted. I was folding laundry when it settled in me fully, not as an idea, but as a fact. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way he expected. Confrontation would have centered him. His explanations. His remorse. His version of events. It would have invited negotiation where none was deserved. I had learned enough to know that people who are comfortable lying don't suddenly become honest when caught. They become persuasive. I wasn't interested in persuasion. What I wanted was clarity, safety, and control over my own future. Those things don't come from emotional showdowns. They come from preparation. So I kept living as if nothing had changed. I asked about his day. I listened. I responded. I laughed at the appropriate moments. I became, to his eyes, the same woman I had always been. Predictable, trusting, present. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer participating. I was observing. That distinction changed everything that I began making small, invisible adjustments. I updated passwords. I organized documents. I made copies of things I had never thought to copy before. Birth certificates, statements, records. I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes. I moved steadily, methodically, as if I were preparing for a trip rather than an ending. He didn't notice. He was too busy maintaining his other life. One evening, he mentioned a restaurant casually. "We should go back there sometime," he said. The food was good. I felt a flicker in my chest, not pain, but awareness. "Sure," I replied evenly. He smiled, relieved by the lack of reaction. He thought the moment had passed. He thought the danger was gone. What he didn't understand was that danger had never been the discovery. It was the silence that followed. As the days went on, I paid close attention to my own emotional state. I expected waves, grief, rage, devastation. They came in brief flashes, but they didn't take over. Every time emotion threatened to pull me into reaction, I reminded myself of the footage, of the ring on the table, of the ease with which he had stepped out of our marriage and into something else. That image anchored me. It reminded me that this wasn't about confusion or temptation. It was about choice. And I was making one now, too. I began imagining my life beyond him, not in fantasy, but in logistics. Where I would live, how I would manage, what I would reclaim. The exercise didn't scare me. It energized me. For the first time in a long while, my future felt like something I was allowed to design rather than endure. One night, lying beside him, listening to his breathing, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of staying and pretending not to see what I'd seen. That fear clarified everything. The footage had shown me his betrayal. Silence was now showing me my strength. And in that quiet, deliberate space, I was building an exit he would never see coming, because he was too busy believing I would never leave without warning. By the time he noticed something was wrong, it would already be over. Not with a scene, with a decision. There is a strange advantage in being underestimated. It gives you room to move. My husband believed he had returned to familiar ground, that whatever tension had flickered in me after the restaurant had passed without consequence. He mistook my composure for forgiveness, my quiet for ignorance. That assumption made him careless. Those were the days he thought he was safe. I noticed how relaxed he became, how his routines resumed their usual rhythm. He lingered longer on his phone again. He stopped watching my expressions so closely. He talked freely about future plans, about trips we might take, things we might do once work calms down. The irony of those conversations wasn't lost on me. He was building a future narrative while I was quietly dismantling the foundation beneath it. I played my part convincingly. I nodded. I agreed. I smiled when appropriate. I didn't rush through conversations or withdraw affection abruptly. Sudden changes invite suspicion. Consistency lulls people into comfort, and comfort breeds mistakes. Behind that consistency, I was doing the most important work of my life. I met quietly with a lawyer under the guise of a lunch meeting. I chose someone who spoke plainly, who asked precise questions, who didn't dramatize my situation. I didn't need sympathy. I needed strategy. I laid out the facts, not emotions. The footage, the patterns, the assets, the timelines. She listened carefully and then said something that stayed with me. "You're in control right now," she said, "and that won't last forever. What you do next matters." I nodded. I already knew. I didn't file anything yet. Filing would have signaled the end. I wasn't ready for the signal. Not until everything was in place. Preparation is invisible. Finality is not. At home, I began reducing my footprint in ways he wouldn't notice until later. I stopped initiating plans that centered us as a couple. I stopped volunteering information about my day. I shifted my attention subtly away from him toward myself. He interpreted it as independence. He liked that. It made him feel less guilty. That guilt, I realized, was shallow. It required reinforcement to exist. When I stopped reinforcing it, it evaporated. One night, he mentioned a work dinner and asked if I minded. I told him to enjoy himself. He kissed my cheek, grateful. I watched him leave and felt nothing but focus. That was the night I finalized something important. Not paperwork, but resolve. I wasn't waiting for proof anymore. I wasn't waiting for remorse. I wasn't waiting for an explanation. I was waiting for the right moment to leave without chaos swallowing me whole. The footage had given me certainty. These days of false safety were giving me leverage. He was revealing exactly how he behaved when he believed there were no consequences. That knowledge was invaluable. When he came home late that night, smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, he crawled into bed beside me without hesitation. He slept easily. I lay awake, not in pain, but in calculation. I thought about how betrayal doesn't always shatter people instantly. Sometimes it sharpens them. It forces a kind of clarity that comfort never produces. I had lived comfortably for years. Now I was living deliberately. The next morning, as we drank coffee together, he reached for my hand. I'm glad things feel normal again, he said. I met his eyes and smiled softly. So am I. He had no idea what normal meant to me now. These were the days he believed the danger had passed. The days he relaxed back into his double life. The days he stopped guarding himself around me. And because of that, he gave me everything I needed to finish what I had started. It happened so quietly that I almost missed it. We were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table one morning, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, arguments, plans, and silences. He was talking about something trivial, an issue at work, a colleague who annoyed him, a deadline that had shifted. I nodded at the right moments, responded when expected. To anyone watching, we looked exactly the same. But inside me, something clicked into place. I wasn't listening to my husband anymore. I was listening to a man I no longer felt connected to. The realization didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It didn't arrive as grief or anger. It arrived as detachment. Clean, precise, final. The emotional cord that had tethered me to him. The one that made his moods matter, his words carry weight, his presence feel grounding, had quietly severed itself. I looked at him and felt nothing. Not hatred, not longing, just distance. That was the moment I knew there was no going back, no matter what he said or did next. Even if he confessed everything, even if he cried, even if he begged. Confessions don't rebuild trust once you've seen how easily someone removes their ring and replaces you in their life without hesitation. Trust doesn't break loudly. It dissolves. After that morning, I stopped thinking of him as my husband in my own mind. The label no longer fit. He became someone I lived with, someone I observed, someone whose choices affected my logistics, not my heart. That shift made everything easier. I stopped feeling offended by his lies. Lies require belief to wound you. I no longer believed in the version of him that those lies were protecting. I stopped wondering who he was texting. Curiosity vanished when relevance did. What replaced it was a calm efficiency. I finalized arrangements quietly. I opened accounts he didn't know about. I redirected deposits. I consulted an accountant and confirmed timelines. I did all of it without secrecy born of fear. This wasn't sneaking. This was separating. At home, he continued to believe things were stable. He even grew affectionate again, as if relieved that the tension he'd sensed had evaporated. He talked about upcoming holidays, about a trip we should plan, just the two of us. I agreed to nothing concrete. Vagueness is a form of truth when you're preparing to leave. One evening, he mentioned the woman from work again, the same name I'd seen repeated in my notes, the same name that lined up with dates and charges. She's been stressed lately, he said casually. Office drama. I watched him carefully as he spoke, noting how practiced his tone was, how smoothly the lie rolled off his tongue. And instead of feeling sick, I felt clarity deepen. This is who he is when he thinks he's safe. Later that night, as he slept beside me, I realized something else that felt almost surreal. The footage from the restaurant no longer replayed in my mind. It had served its purpose. It wasn't haunting me anymore. It had freed me. Because once you truly see someone, without illusion, without hope filtering the image, you don't need reminders. The truth stands on its own. The next phase of my life wasn't going to be about catching him, exposing him, or punishing him. It was going to be about leaving with my dignity intact and my future secured. He still believed he had time. I knew better. And that difference in awareness was about to change everything. That week passed like any other on the surface, and that was precisely what made it powerful. Routine is a disguise. When nothing looks urgent, no one suspects preparation. My husband moved through his days with the ease of someone who believed the storm had passed. He left for work on time, complained about traffic, kissed me goodbye without looking me in the eyes for too long. Familiar gestures, emptied of meaning. Meanwhile, I was reclaiming my life one silent step at a time. I scheduled appointments under neutral names in my calendar. I made copies of documents and stored them in places he would never think to look. I rerouted things gradually. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. Sudden changes leave trails. Gradual ones disappear into normalcy. Each small action grounded me further. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing. I noticed how differently I carried myself now. My shoulders were relaxed. My breathing was steady. There was no frantic edge to my thoughts. People often imagine that leaving requires emotional chaos. For me, it required emotional clarity. The chaos had already happened the moment I watched that footage. Everything after was simply alignment. One afternoon, as I sat in a quiet office finalizing details, I felt a flicker of sadness. Not for him, but for the version of myself who would never have imagined being here. The woman who trusted without question, who believed marriage was a shared reality rather than parallel lives intersecting at convenience. That woman had done nothing wrong. She had just outgrown her environment. At home, my husband talked freely. He complained. He joked. He spoke about plans months away as if the ground beneath us were solid. I listened without correcting him. Not because I wanted to spare his feelings, but because there was no point in interrupting someone who was already walking toward an ending they couldn't see. One night, he asked, "You seem lighter lately. Did something change?" I met his gaze and smiled gently. I stopped carrying things that weren't mine. He laughed, assuming it was a metaphor about stress. It wasn't. As the week progressed, I began to detach emotionally in ways that felt almost surgical. I stopped anticipating his needs, stopped adjusting my schedule to fit his, stopped framing my thoughts around we. That mental shift was subtle but irreversible. Once you stop narrating your life as a shared story, it becomes very difficult to return to the illusion. I caught myself one evening, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, looking at the space as if it belonged to someone else. The familiarity was still there, but the attachment was gone. Objects don't hold meaning on their own. They borrow it from belief. And my belief had moved on. There was a moment, brief, honest, when I wondered if I should say something. If I owed him a chance to explain. If silence was cruel. Then I remembered the footage. The ease. The ring. The laughter. Cruelty isn't silence after betrayal. Cruelty is betrayal performed comfortably. That realization dissolved any lingering doubt. By the end of the week, everything essential was in place. Not my exit. Not yet, but my independence. My safety. My options. I wasn't cornered. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't guessing. I was ready. That readiness didn't feel like victory. It felt like stability. Like standing on solid ground after realizing you'd been balancing on something fragile for far too long. He still believed this was just a phase. A return to normal. A quiet patch after imagined tension. What he didn't understand was that normal no longer existed for me. I had seen the truth. And once you see it clearly, you don't unsee it. You move forward, calmly, deliberately, and without looking back. The slip wasn't dramatic. It never is when someone believes they're untouchable. It came wrapped in routine, delivered casually, like a detail too small to matter. Those are the moments that reveal the most. It was a Friday night. He came home later than usual, smelling faintly of cologne he never wore for me. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't need to. In his mind, the danger had passed. I had settled back into myself. He was safe again. We sat on the couch, the television murmuring in the background. He scrolled through his phone, relaxed, shoulders loose. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, not with suspicion, but with quiet attention. There's a difference. Suspicion is anxious. Attention is calm. Funny thing happened at work, he said suddenly. I waited. He told a story about a colleague, about a mix-up with reservations, about how a dinner plan had changed last minute. He laughed as he spoke, animated, comfortable. And then he said it. I almost went back to the restaurant to grab my jacket, he added, shaking his head. But I figured it could wait. The words landed with a precision that made my chest tighten. The restaurant. The same one. He had already been back. He didn't notice my stillness. He kept talking, unaware that he had just contradicted his own carefully maintained timeline. He didn't realize he confirmed something I already knew but hadn't yet placed in sequence. People who lie often forget which version they've told. Comfort erodes vigilance. I smiled faintly. You should be careful leaving things behind, I said. He laughed. Yeah, well, it happens. Yes, it does. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake thinking not about confrontation, but about inevitability. The truth has a way of surfacing without being summoned. All it needs is time and enough rope. He had both. I wasn't collecting these moments to hurt him. I wasn't even collecting them to protect myself anymore. I was observing the natural end of something that could no longer be sustained. The structure of his double life relied on me remaining static. Once I moved, quietly, internally, the structure began to wobble on its own. The next day, I acted no differently. Consistency was my ally. I ran errands, answered messages, maintained the rhythm he expected. The more normal I appeared, the more he relaxed. The more he relaxed, the more careless he became. He left his laptop open on the kitchen counter that afternoon. Not locked, not angled away. Just there. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The pattern had already been established. Evidence wasn't my goal anymore. Closure was. I realized something important then. I didn't want a confession. Confessions are performative. They center the speaker. They ask for absolution. What I wanted was distance. Clean, unambiguous distance. That evening, he asked if I wanted to go out. Just us, he said, smiling. Like old times. The phrase struck me, like old times. He didn't know those old times had already ended. Not because of the footage alone, but because of everything that followed it. Because of the ease with which he had continued. Because of the comfort he felt lying beside me while living elsewhere in his head. I'm tired, I said. Maybe another night. He nodded, unbothered. Sure. He didn't press. He didn't question. He didn't sense the finality in my tone. That's the thing about endings decided in silence. They don't announce themselves to the people who caused them. Later, as I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, I looked at my reflection and felt something settle. Not resolve. That had already happened. Acceptance. The quiet kind that doesn't ache. I was no longer waiting for the right moment to confront him. I was waiting for the right moment to leave. And that moment was getting closer. Not because I was counting days, but because my life was already reorganizing itself around a future that didn't include him. Every decision I made now pointed in one direction. Forward. The footage had shown me what he did when he thought I wasn't watching. Time was showing me who he was when he thought I had forgiven. And neither version belonged in my life anymore. That'd be why the time I reached this point, leaving no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a transition, calculated, intentional, and already in motion. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was simply following through. What surprised me most was how invisible preparation can be when people assume permanence. My husband still believed our life was intact. He talked about the future freely, confidently. He mentioned renovations we might do, trips we might plan, holidays months away. He spoke as if the ground beneath us were solid, never noticing how carefully I'd stepped off it. I listened without correcting him. Correction would have required engagement. I had moved beyond that. I began packing slowly, selectively. Not boxes stacked in corners, not suitcases by the door. Just quiet subtraction. A blouse here, documents there. Things that mattered, removed gradually from shared spaces and placed somewhere safe. I left behind what was replaceable, what held no emotional charge, what belonged to a life I had already released. I noticed how differently I moved through the house now. I no longer lingered in doorways. I no longer paused to adjust things to his preferences. I occupied space efficiently, without apology. That shift alone would have unsettled him if he'd been paying attention. He wasn't. He had returned fully to his other life, reassured by my silence, buoyed by the belief that whatever tension had surfaced after the restaurant had dissolved. He assumed I had accepted his reality, or at least chosen not to disrupt it. That assumption gave me everything I needed. I finalized arrangements quietly. I confirmed dates. I secured access. I prepared contingencies. I didn't dramatize any of it in my own mind. Drama clouds judgment. I treated this the way I would treat any major decision, with focus and restraint. One afternoon, while he was at work, I stood in the living room and looked around for a long time. Not with nostalgia, with assessment. This space had once held meaning because of what I believed lived inside it. Now it was just a structure, walls, furniture, objects. The emotional weight had already been removed. I realized then that I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger had been useful earlier. It had sharpened my awareness. But now it had done its job and stepped aside. What remained was resolve, calm, self-trust. That night, He asked if I wanted to watch a movie together. We haven't done that in a while, he said, almost wistfully. I agreed. We sat side by side on the couch, the screen flickering in front of us. At one point, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it, not out of affection, but out of clarity. I was no longer confused by physical proximity. Touch doesn't equal connection. It never has. As the movie played, I thought about the footage again, not with pain, but with gratitude. Without it, I might still be negotiating with doubt. Without it, I might have confronted him prematurely and allowed the truth to be buried under apologies and promises. Seeing is final. It removes the possibility of denial. That knowledge had given me this moment, the ability to leave cleanly without begging or pleading or bargaining. After the movie ended, he kissed my temple. I'm glad we're okay, he said. I met his eyes. So am I. And I meant it, just not in the way he thought. Later, lying in bed, I felt no urge to rehearse what I would say when I left. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need his understanding. The exit didn't require explanation to be valid. My life didn't require his consent to move forward. That was the most liberating realization of all. Leaving wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be dramatic. It wasn't going to give him a chance to rewrite the story. It was going to be precise. The footage had shown me the truth. Time had given me strategy, and silence had given me the space to walk away without losing myself in the process. When I finally left, it would not feel like loss. It would feel like alignment. The day everything finally made sense didn't announce itself with final papers or packed boxes. It arrived disguised as an ordinary morning. Sunlight through the curtains. Coffee brewing. My husband moving around the house, humming to himself, completely unaware that the version of our life he believed in no longer existed anywhere except in his head. I watched him from the kitchen doorway as he tied his shoes. There was a time when that small, familiar sight would have filled me with comfort. Now it felt like watching a scene from a past I had already left. Familiar, but no longer mine. He glanced up and smiled. I might be late tonight, he said. Work stuff. Of course. Okay, I replied calmly. That single word carried no weight anymore. It wasn't permission. It wasn't trust. It was simply acknowledgement. He kissed my cheek and walked out the door without hesitation, confident that his routines remained unquestioned. As the door closed, something inside me settled completely. This was it. Not the moment I would leave physically, but the moment I left emotionally for good. There was no curiosity left, no lingering hope, no urge to wait and see. I felt grounded in a decision that no longer required reinforcement. I spent that morning finishing the last things I needed to do. I checked accounts. I confirmed access. I reviewed timelines one final time. Everything was ready. I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't panicking. I was steady. At one point, I paused and realized how different this felt from how people describe heartbreak. There was no chaos, no desperation, no urge to collapse. Betrayal had burned through all of that already. What remained was clarity. I remember the manager's voice, "Don't faint when you see it," and understood now that fainting would have been easier. Shock would have passed quickly. Confusion might have lingered, but it would have softened. What I experienced instead was awakening. An awakening doesn't reverse itself. In the afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The same streets, the same houses, the same neighbors who waved politely, unaware that the woman walking past them was in the middle of ending a life chapter they had always seen as stable. That anonymity felt protective. No one needed to know yet. When I returned home, I packed the final items I had left untouched until now. Not many, just what mattered. I moved quietly, deliberately, without ceremony. I didn't take photos. I didn't linger. I didn't say goodbye to rooms. Goodbyes are for things you still feel connected to. As evening approached, my phone buzzed. A message from my husband, running later than expected. "Don't wait up." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Okay," I typed. That was the last message I would send him from that house. I sat on the edge of the bed and took a slow breath. Not to steady myself, but to acknowledge the moment. This wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even closure. It was alignment. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked out the front door without looking back. No tears. No shaking hands, just a quiet certainty that the life I was leaving behind had already ended the moment I saw him remove his ring and place it on that table like it meant nothing. The footage had shown me the truth. This day gave me permission to act on it. And for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I felt something unmistakable settle into my chest. Relief that I didn't go far that first night. Distance wasn't the point. Separation was. I stayed somewhere quiet, neutral, a place that didn't carry the weight of shared memories or unspoken expectations. When I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence wrapped around me. Not heavy, not hollow, just still. I slept deeply. That surprised me. I had expected restlessness, replaying conversations, imagined confrontations. None of that came. My body seemed to recognize safety before my mind articulated it. I woke the next morning clear-headed, grounded, certain. My phone was silent at first. Then it wasn't. A missed call. Then another. Then a message. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. More messages followed, their tone shifting subtly from concern to confusion. I could almost hear him pacing the house, retracing steps, trying to place the moment when things had changed. That's the thing about silent exits. They don't give the other person a script. Without a fight, without tears, without accusations, they're left alone with the echo of their assumptions. I went about my day deliberately. I ate. I walked. I handled practical matters. I didn't rush to explain myself. Explanation would have centered his need for reassurance. I wasn't interested in reassurance. I was interested in finality. By midday, the messages had changed again. "Please call me. Did I do something? Can we talk?" I read them without emotion. This was the silence he didn't know how to handle. He had lived comfortably inside secrets and half-truths, but silence, real silence, unsettled him. Silence doesn't negotiate. It doesn't clarify. It forces reflection. I wasn't punishing him. I was allowing consequence to exist. Late that afternoon, I sent one message. "I know." That was all. No details. No accusations. No elaboration. The response was immediate. "What do you mean?" "No what? Please talk to me." I turned my phone face down. If he was going to understand, it wouldn't be because I walked him through it. It would be because the truth he'd been avoiding finally caught up to him. I had carried clarity long enough. It was his turn. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt something else surface, gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for the way it had ended. Cleanly, quietly, without me losing myself in the process. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. How a confrontation might have spiraled into explanations and apologies. How tears could have softened resolve. How doubt might have crept back in. Instead, I had chosen silence. And silence had done exactly what I needed it to do. It gave me space. It gave him truth. And it closed a chapter without allowing it to reopen itself through negotiation. By the end of the night, my phone had stopped buzzing. I imagined him sitting alone, piecing things together, replaying moments he thought were insignificant. The restaurant, the purse, the delay, the calm that followed. For the first time, he was the one watching footage in his mind. Scenes he hadn't expected to matter, now impossible to ignore. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt peace. Because I had left without begging, without chasing explanations, without shrinking to make room for someone else's dishonesty. The footage had weakened my legs, but the silence had strengthened my spine. And that strength was carrying me forward into a life that finally belonged to me. Days passed without resolution, and that was intentional. I didn't rush to define what I had already accepted. While he searched for answers, I lived inside certainty. That difference mattered more than anything I could have said to him. Eventually, he stopped asking where I was. Instead, the messages shifted into something heavier. "I think I know what this is about. I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't what it looked like." I didn't respond, because it was exactly what it looked like. I imagined him replaying the night at the restaurant, realizing how many assumptions he had made about my blindness. I imagined the panic setting in as he recognized the weight of his own carelessness. People who rely on secrecy rarely prepare for exposure, especially exposure that comes without confrontation. What unsettled him most wasn't that I knew. It was that I had left without asking him to explain. Explanations give people power. They create space to reshape reality. I had removed that space entirely. He was left alone with the truth, and for the first time, no one was cushioning it for him. I received one final message late one night. I saw the footage. That was it. No excuses. No denial. Just admission. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not feeling vindicated, not feeling relieved, just aware. Awareness had become my default state. I understood then that whatever remorse he felt now wasn't born of empathy. It was born of consequence. And consequence, while necessary, doesn't rebuild what was lost. I replied once. Yes. One word. No elaboration. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was an ending. I spent that week settling fully into my new reality. I moved into my own space. I reestablished routines that belonged only to me. I filled my days with things that required my presence rather than my patience. The contrast between my life now and the one I had left behind was striking. Not because it was louder or more exciting, but because it was honest. I noticed how my body responded differently to my environment. No tension in my shoulders. No hyper-awareness of someone else's moods. No instinct to manage emotional weather that wasn't mine to control. Peace, I learned, is physiological. It shows up in sleep, in breath, in posture. I thought about how close I had come to staying, how easily I could have convinced myself that the footage was a misunderstanding, that silence was cowardice, that confrontation was required for closure. How many people stay because they believe clarity must be negotiated? I was grateful I hadn't made that mistake. Leaving had forced him to face himself without distraction. It had forced me to choose myself without apology. Neither of those outcomes required shouting. The truth doesn't need volume. It needs space. And I had created enough distance for it to finally stand on its own. The life that began after I walked away did not announce itself with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It unfolded quietly, the way real change does when it is no longer trying to prove anything. I didn't wake up feeling triumphant. I woke up feeling grounded. And that, I learned, was far more powerful. I settled into my own space slowly. I chose what stayed and what went. I arranged furniture not for symmetry, but for comfort. I filled the rooms with light instead of expectation. Every decision I made was small, deliberate, and entirely mine. That autonomy felt unfamiliar at first, like wearing a new coat that hadn't yet molded to my shoulders. But with each passing day, it fit better. I noticed how my thoughts changed. I no longer replayed conversations, searching for what I could have said differently. I no longer imagined alternate endings where honesty arrived earlier or remorse came in time. Those mental loops had vanished, replaced by something steadier: presence. I was where I was, doing what I was doing, without a second narrative running underneath it. People reached out cautiously. Some asked questions without really asking them. Others avoided the topic entirely, as if silence were safer than truth. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't offer explanations. My life was no longer a group project. Understanding was optional. What mattered was how I felt in my own body. I felt lighter, not euphoric light, as if I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. I moved through my days without bracing for disappointment, without scanning for signs, without anticipating lies. That constant vigilance had been exhausting. I hadn't realized how tired I was until it was gone. Occasionally, memories surfaced: the restaurant, the footage, the ring on the table. But they no longer carried the same charge. They were facts now, not wounds. They reminded me why I left, not why I hurt. There's a profound difference between those two things. I understood then that betrayal doesn't always end relationships in the moment it's discovered. Sometimes it ends them earlier, in the quiet accumulation of disrespect, secrecy, and emotional distance. The footage hadn't destroyed my marriage. It had revealed that it had already been dismantled piece by piece without my consent. Walking away wasn't abandonment. It was acknowledgement. I thought about the woman who had walked back into that restaurant, expecting nothing more than a forgotten purse. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her something important. That the moment her legs weakened was not the moment she lost stability, it was the moment she stopped pretending the ground beneath her was solid. What followed wasn't collapse, it was recalibration. I didn't rebuild my life to prove anything to him. I rebuilt it to honor myself. That distinction shaped everything that came next. I chose relationships carefully. I valued transparency over charm, consistency over intensity. I listened to discomfort instead of rationalizing it away. I trusted myself enough to leave situations that required me to shrink. There was no dramatic closure conversation, no final showdown. The ending had already happened the night I walked out with my bag and didn't look back. Everything after that was just adjustment. And adjustment, I discovered, can be gentle. One evening, standing alone in my living room, watching dusk settle outside the window, I felt something settle inside me too. Not relief, not pride, ownership. My life belonged to me again, fully, unmistakably, without shared authorship. I didn't lose my marriage that night. I found my clarity. And clarity, once found, doesn't fade. It becomes the lens through which you see everything that follows. It teaches you that silence can be strength, that walking away can be wisdom, and that sometimes the most powerful ending is the one you choose without asking permission. I didn't walk away because I was weak. I walked away because I finally saw clearly. Betrayal doesn't always come screaming. It often arrives quietly, confident you'll never look closely enough to notice. But the moment you do, the moment the truth stands in front of you without excuses or distractions, everything changes. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need explanations. I needed honesty with myself. And once I chose that, there was no going back. Some endings don't shatter you. They set you free. And the life that begins after that kind of ending is stronger, calmer, and entirely your own.